YouTube! Today we'll be discussing femininities. So last time we discussed masculinities and how and where they relate to each other in the pecking order of masculine behavior. Femininity, or femininities, on the other hand, work a little differently. Because we live in a society that values masculine traits over feminine traits, the hierarchy of femininities operates within a system of subordination to masculinity. This means, for our purposes, it's important to not only look at the way that femininity interacts with femininity, but the ways in which it interacts with masculinity. For example, if you look up how to be more feminine, most of the articles that come up stress the importance of femininity as the natural companion to masculinity. Nature's balancing act, if you will. And usually, when discussing the need for increased femininity, it's usually paired with the threat of masculine disapproval. Or in other words, if you as a woman are not feminine enough, you're gonna end up alone. Now, we're not gonna get into the details of articles like these because frankly, I find them boring. But I do wanna address the frequency of these the less feminine you are, the harder it is to find a man arguments. Here we go. Masculinity and femininity as concepts are constructed relationally, which means that they are separate but always refer back to each other. For example, masculinity is hard while femininity is soft. Masculinity is strong while femininity is vulnerable. And masculinity is the protector while femininity is the caregiver, and so on. It's the whole idea of opposites attract, and that in order to be whole, you have to find your missing half. So despite the fact that what we have designated as masculine and feminine traits exist within all bodies simultaneously, they are gendered as belonging to only the male or female body and then set up as complementary to each other. This is because typically when we think about the relationships between masculinity and femininity, we think along the lines of the male and female binary, and furthermore through a heteronormative lens. Heteronormative being the worldview that has heterosexuality or straightness being the presumed or preferred sexual orientation. It's seen as natural, while other sexualities and identities are seen as unnatural or weird. A really good example of this would be when children have friends of another gender, and parents refer to those friends as either the child's boyfriend or girlfriend. I've got news for you. That's not your son's girlfriend. Your son is 3. But the result of this is that romantic relationships are presumably set up between men and women, and it's why non-heterosexual couples are usually asked who is the man and who is the woman in their relationship. Lovely. What's important about this is that even though no one person has strictly feminine or masculine characteristics, the associated relationship between masculinity and femininity still exists, which ultimately paves the way for rigid gender roles and gendered social practices. It takes 2 to tango, and it takes a man to bring home the bacon and a woman to cook it. Okay, Kaylee. So if femininity is co-constructed with masculinity, how do multiple femininities work? I'm glad you asked, YouTube. Just as the case with masculinity, there's hegemonic femininity, which embodies the characteristics that a group defines as womanly and establishes and legitimizes a complementary relationship with hegemonic masculinity. A great example of this, if we were to go back to Gaston, would be the 3 blonde triplets, who are soft, frail, and fawning to Gaston's hardness and strength. This complementary relationship ultimately reinforces gender hierarchy, with men being dominant over women. Therefore, successful feminine performance reinforces masculinity. Or as Susan Brown Miller puts it, femininity is more pleasing because it makes men appear more masculine by contrast. So what exactly does successful feminine performance look like, and what does it mean for those who fail at it? As previously stated, creating a successful feminine identity relies on its relationship to masculinity as something opposite. So while what is specifically defined as masculine or feminine varies on the culture, space, and time of the group defining it, what remains constant is that masculinity, by definition, cannot be feminine, and vice versa. Therefore, when women exhibit traits that are traditionally considered masculine, they are stigmatized and treated as abnormal. This results in what Mimi Schippers calls pariah femininities. Now, pariah femininities are femininities that deviate from the gender script and take on aspects of hegemonic masculinity. Some examples of this can be sexual desire for women, promiscuity, strength, and aggressiveness. By taking on certain traits that are seen as challenging rather than complementary, they're seen as a threat to hegemonic masculinity because they do not stand in subordination to it, which ultimately compromises the relationship between femininity and masculinity as a whole. Therefore, when a woman takes on these hegemonic masculine characteristics, her femininity is compromised and she is seen as an other. And, more importantly, an other reduced completely to that characteristic, a certain kind of person. So she becomes a lesbian, a slut, or a bitch. And to take it one step further, these traits, because they're being performed by a woman, can no longer be seen as masculine, but rather a tainted or inferior form of femininity. Or in other words, as soon as a traditionally masculine trait is displayed by a woman, it's not a masculine trait, but rather an unattractive feminine quality. For example, authority is great in a man, but becomes bitchiness in a woman. However, the same situation can be said for men who exhibit feminine traits. Because femininity is seen as a contaminant, we see things like weakness, whiteness or same-sex desire for men, and labels like fag, pussy, and wimp. Also lovely. The relationship between femininities and masculinities is further complicated by taking into account the race and class of individuals. As previously discussed, intersectionality, or the ways in which a person's many identities intersect to create different experiences of oppression, plays an important role when discussing gender hierarchies. Traits that are valued by white hegemonic masculinity and femininity may differ from traits that are considered hegemonic in Asian masculinity and femininity. And in the hierarchy of femininities, if the dominant culture of your overall society values whiteness, then Asians' expression of femininity would be seen as subordinate to white expressions of femininity and therefore othered. And to take that one step further, if you can't afford access to certain expressions of hegemonic masculinity and femininity, then you are also othered and stigmatized. It's a whole mess of ideas that basically amounts to Gretchen Wieners yelling, "You can't sit with us," and all of the real-world consequences of inequality piled on top. By now you're probably thinking, that's shitty. Now I'm upset. Why you gotta hate on masculinity and femininity, Kaylee? To which I would say I'm not. Masculinity and femininity, the traits themselves are fine. It's the way in which they're assigned and used to create hierarchies with one group over another that's the issue. Which isn't to say that all relationships between masculinity and femininity are problematic. There are alternative expressions of masculinities and femininities that value different traits in men and women, but do not have a relationship of dominance and subordination. It's not all bad. And on that note, I've run out of time for today. As always, I couldn't cover everything in this video. So if you're interested in learning more, check out the links in the description or feel free to ask questions in the comments below. This week's question is, what are some examples of hegemonic feminine traits that you can think of? What are some examples of pariah femininities that you can think of? And what are potential alternative expressions of masculinity and femininity that you've seen? Next time we'll be beginning our discussion on colonization, imperialism, and racism. So stay tuned. But until then, happy unlearning.